Namo Buddhaya. Good evening. Welcome to the Buddha Dhamma TV. I am Karen Tan. Today begin our program with a Buddhist hymn, Jaya Mangala Gata, Stanzas of Joyous Victory by Wayfarers.
Bahum Sahasramabhini Mita Sayudantang Diri Mekalang Udita Gora Sasena Marang Dana Jita Bangulindo Tampe Jasa Babatute Jaya Mangalani
Good triumph over evil. With gentleness, overcome anger. With charity, overcome stinginess. With truth, overcome deceit. This the Buddha taught. When the Lord was stormed by Mara, challenged to a battle by Alavaka, and attacked by the ferocious elephant, Nalagiri, He subdued them all with his perfection of giving, patience, and all-embracing love. By the power of that spiritual glory, may joyous victory be yours.
Gorang Panalabaka Maka
listened yesterday to the first part of this course entitled Coming to the End of the Five by Venerable Dr. Bhikkhu Bodhi. We now invite Dr. Bodhi Mahathera to deliver the second part of his sermons.
Bante, I have a question about the arising of the Buddha, the next Buddha after final Nibbana.
Wait, I have to increase the volume. The volume is not coming through. Okay. Okay, try again.
Can you hear me?
Okay, yeah.
I have a question about arising of the Buddha after the teachings of the Buddha has completely disappeared. So, for example, like our Gautama Buddha has finally reached Nibbana, and then the next Buddha that arises is going to be Maitreya. But my question is, like, I read somewhere that the new teachings will only arise after the teachings of the previous Buddha has completely disappeared. But there's always deities and devas in Tusita heaven and bodhisattvas. They know the Dhamma. How can a new Buddha ever arise if those devas have aeons and aeons of life?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, go on. So that was the question.
Yes. I just want to understand the conditions for the arising.
Yeah, sometimes we come into these little conceptual problems. But I think what is meant is that in the human world, the teaching of one Buddha has to completely vanish before another Buddha can arise. Okay, now Maitreya, as a bodhisattva in the Tusita world, will have the knowledge of the Dhamma, but then he passes away from that world and comes into the human world. And when he comes into the human world, then my assumption is that he undergoes a kind of loss of knowledge, complete loss of knowledge of the Dhamma. So he has to discover it again entirely on his own. But these are matters that, are beyond my own domain of ability to answer.
Thank you.
Okay, is it BC Deborah?
Yes, hi, thank you, Bhante. This is Deborah's partner. I really appreciate your teaching. Just listening to your teaching this morning, I realized I had to confess I've had a significant loss of reverence for some of the spiritual leaders, some of the Buddhist leaders, specifically the Dalai Lama. And I really struggle sometimes just to trust what they're saying.
Struggle to what?
To trust their teaching.
Yeah.
And to trust their leadership. And it's been very difficult for me just to continue. I'm sort of very new on the path, but I was wondering if you had any ideas about how to push through this obstacle I have.
Yeah, well, I think, you're taking that as in relation to reverence and deference towards the Sangha?
Yes, towards the Sangha.
Okay, what I say is that the Sangha here, I guess the Buddha is, okay, let's put aside the question of contemporary teachers. If you read the Vinaya Pitaka, that is the book of discipline, which is there are numerous incidents that are described there taking place during the time of the Buddha, while the Buddha was alive, describing the conduct of members of the Sangha, and a lot of the incidents are horrific, shocking, degrading, objectionable. So what really meant the object of reverence and deference, the Sangha as the object of reverence and deference, should be the Aryan Sangha, the community of the noble ones. We don't know individually whether this one is a noble one, that one is a noble one, but at least we have some idea of what are the standards of conduct to which a noble one should conform, or at least that an ordinary monastic the standards of conduct towards which an ordinary monastic should aspire. And so we take that as the object of reverence and deference, and not individual monastics as such. Does that make it clear?
Sorry. Yes, it does. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, next will be Sud, Dr. Sud.
Thank you, Bhante, for your teaching today. I just wanted to ask, based on what we talked about today, so, you know, how in lay life, especially when, you know, someone is motivated to practice the Dhamma and then, you know, is really, really motivated once somebody hears the teaching of the Dhamma, and, you know, maybe today I might be motivated, but then by Friday, like this week, it dies down and you're falling into, you know, the worldly, you know, affairs. And then, you know, you kind of lose the track of practice.
Yeah.
So based on what we talked about today, why is that? Is that because of doubt, underlying doubt, or is it because of not doubt, but just neglect? I mean, what is the main reason you think is?
Yeah, it's not necessarily because of doubt. I think that's just the way the human mind works. And I see that in my own experience as well, that it's just that sometimes one could put forth a lot of effort and energy, and then there comes times when you have to sort of relax a little bit. So that's quite natural and normal. But what is necessary is to prevent oneself from really sliding downhill, going from one level down to another level to another level. From time to time, it's necessary to maybe relax a little bit before you start picking up the effort again. Yes, I say don't blame yourself and condemn yourself if there are these moments of slackness. But the important thing is to keep one's confidence and trust, keep it alive, and keep one's effort alive, even if there is a natural sort of unevenness in the movement of one's effort.
Thank you.
Okay, unless BC Deborah has another question, because I see the hand is up. Oh,
I'm sorry. No, I'll lower it. I do not have enough.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think we can go on with our, Megan Ferry.
Thank you, Bhante. My question, maybe you've already answered with BC Deborah, but it's a question related to doubt and also the Aryan Sangha. And we've looked at there are different monastic systems or groupings. Where does secular Buddhism sit within this context?
Yeah, I think that brings up maybe a very different issue. So maybe we'll just pass over that question now.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, because it's too big a whole big different area. Okay, Doran, did you have a question?
Thank you, Bhante. This is a slightly related question to Sutta 201 that brought a question I've had in my mind. The Sutta 201 was talking about the Buddha's concern for what might happen in the world after the Tathagata expires. And I was always wondering what happens after. One question this brought up is what happens after the Tathagata reaches Nibbana? Not what happens to the outside world, but what happens internally to the Buddha. Do they still need, is your belief that they still need to maintain the state of Nibbana? In other words, the Buddha, when he reached Nibbana and enlightenment, he continued to practice for 50 years, continued to meditate every day. So that seems to imply to me that one still needs, the defilements can still creep in if you don't maintain your state. That's my question. Does that state need to be maintained?
Yeah, no. Once a Buddha achieves Buddhahood or an Arahat achieves Arhatship, there are no more defilements, no more latent tendencies to the defilements, but you could say that their practice is done just as a natural expression of their attainment, of their realization. They don't have to, or they don't undertake the practice in order to continue to work on purifying the mind. But the defilements, the Buddha says that greed, hatred, delusion, or the 4 or the 3 asavas, or the latent tendencies have been.
Thank you.
Uchina mula, that's the word, cut off at the root, made, pulled out like the stump of a palm tree, unable to arise again in the future. But it's just sort of the natural mode of behavior of one who is liberated.
Thank you for clarifying that.
And they do enter like into the jhanic states and the special meditative attainments in order to experience sort of that bliss and tranquility of the meditative state. Because I imagined, especially being a Buddha, it's pretty hard work, you know. We always see, like, everywhere we see the picture or statues of the Buddha just sitting with the eyes closed, the legs crossed. But, you know, it ain't like that, but the Buddha is spending like 12 hours a day going around teaching, traveling from town to town, city to city, having to settle quarrels amongst the monks. In the evening, when he's near a town or city, hundreds of lay people will come. He has to give a sermon, a discourse, then people will come asking questions. And so he has to rest the mind from time to time. And so they'll go into the meditative absorptions, but it's not to eliminate or to remove any more defilements that have not been removed.
Thank you, Ante, for clarifying.
Okay, let us then move. Let's see what else is in our grab bag. Okay, we did the 5 bondages. Oh, rice porridge. 5 benefits of rice porridge. Okay, so this is in the Pali word is yagu, but in contemporary usage, I think in India it's called kanji. And it could be made of rice, but here in America, it could be oatmeal or it could be wheatina, I guess. So it dispels hunger, dispels thirst, it settles wind, it cleans out the bladder, it promotes the digestion of the remnants of undigested food. Okay, that's what the sutta says. I don't know whether I could testify for all of those advantages. And even, okay, 5 dangers or drawbacks in not brushing one's teeth. See, even the Buddha gives I should send this to my dentist because he's a Buddhist in New York City. So he could put it up, wow, I'll send it to him, put it up on in his clinic, because he is in Chinatown, and I think probably a lot of his patients are Chinese Buddhists. Maybe somebody could translate it into Chinese also. So he's English speaking, so probably those who come will also speak English. 5 dangers in not brushing one's teeth. I don't know if there's anybody who's a doctor specializing in ophthalmology, but it says it's bad for one's eyes. I don't know the connection there. One's breath stinks. The taste buds are not purified. Bile and phlegm envelop one's food, and one's food becomes disagreeable. So those are the 5 dangers in not brushing the teeth. And then if any of you have little children, you could give them the 5 benefits in brushing one's teeth. It's good for the eyes, good for the breath, good for the taste buds, And then bile and phlegm don't envelop one's food, and one's food has an agreeable taste. 5 benefits in brushing one's teeth. Okay, next, 5 dangers in reciting the Dhamma with a drawn-out song-like intonation. Okay, so I have to say, yeah, these days in Sri Lanka, I think that style of reciting with a drawn-out song-like intonation has become prominent. Like there's this particular style of reciting that goes like this, and maybe my imitation is not so good. Are there any, maybe if there are some Sri Lankan Sinhalese Buddhists, they will recognize this style. Okay, this will be the beginning of the Mangala Sutta. And please, Bhante Buddha, please forgive me. I just want people to get an idea what that drawn-out style is. Evang me sutang ekang samayang Bhagava. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Gita, do you hear chanting like that? Maybe not in Canada.
Yes, Bhante. Yes, it sounds familiar. Yeah. Yeah, it's really drawn out. You're right. Yeah.
Vincent, are you familiar with chanting like that style? Okay.
Yes, Bhante, yes, it's in Sri Lanka. They do have that.
They do it
sort of like a prolonged, just as Bhante was doing it. Yeah, thank you.
So the normal style would be like Evang me sutang ekang samayang bhagava savatiyang viharati. So that's very just in a very flat, normal style, giving proper length to each syllable, not drawing anything out. Okay, but let's see what some of it happens. Okay.
Yes, Bhante, I'm familiar. Yeah.
Yeah, so one becomes infatuated with one's own style of chanting. Others become infatuated with one's intonation. So actually, if one chants in a normal style, but with a pleasant voice, others can still become infatuated. And now a present-day trend that I don't like, but it's, if you go onto YouTube, there are some monks with very, very good chanting style, but the current fashion is to have a musical background accompaniment to the chanting. There's one monk, I think his name maybe is Indaratana, very beautiful chanting voice, but you have in the background, you hear like violins playing, string instruments. I don't know why they do that, because he has such a nice chanting voice on his own, doesn't need any music. Okay, then householders complain, just as we sing, so these ascetics, the followers of the Buddha, they are just singing also. And then it's a disruption of one's concentration, and then those in the next generation follow one's example. Okay, here, again, this is going to also tie up with the theme of conflict within the Sangha, especially the monk who creates trouble within the Sangha. This is one who insults and disparages his fellow monks, who becomes a reviler of the noble ones. 5 dangers can be expected. So he he either commits a parajika. A parajika is an offense. There are different classes of offense, different classes of monastic rules, and the heaviest class is called parajika. The word parajika means what brings defeat. So one who commits a parajika loses his status as a monk, or for a bhikkhuni loses the status of bhikkhuni. So for a monk, there are 4 offenses that constitute a parajika that bring about the loss of status. One is to engage in sexual intercourse. Second is to commit an act of theft of a degree of severity that would entail some kind of legal penalty from the civilian government. Third is to kill a human being. And the fourth is to falsely and knowingly make claims to supernormal attainment. So I don't see how insulting and disparaging one's fellow monks would lead one to commit a parajika. Possible, but I don't know how that's the case. The second is one will commit a certain defiled offense, and this is a kind of offense of a type. It doesn't cut off one's status as a monk, but it requires one to perform a kind of penance in the presence of the entire resident monastic community. And amongst these will be accusing a fellow monk of falsely and knowingly accusing a fellow monk of having committed a parajika offense. So I guess if one monk hates another monk strongly enough, he might accuse that monk of committing a parajika offense. And then if he's forced to confess, then he'll admit that it was a false accusation, and then he commits that defiled offense. Okay, third, one contracts a severe illness. Sometimes I don't really see the direct causal connection, but this is very serious. One will die confused, and then with the breakup of the body after death, one will be heading for a bad rebirth. That's especially in the case of reviling noble ones, that is, disciples who have reached any of the levels of Aryan attainment, stream entry, once returning, non-returning, and most serious of all is arhatship. And the example of this that comes out in a number of suttas, parallel suttas, is, what was his name? Kolika. He was a monk who reviled and disparaged Sariputta and Moggallana. He came to the Buddha and said, "Bhante, Sariputta and Moggallana are bad monks, they're corrupt monks, they're trying to get close to you just to seek their personal advantage." And then the Buddha admonished him and said, "Do not criticize Sariputta and Moggallana. Those are the excellent, wonderful monks. You should respect them, you should follow them, you should listen to them." But this monk Kolya kept on insisting. Again and again he reviled and insulted Sariputta and Moggallana. And then as a result, this is where the severe illness took place. Sort of as the immediate karmic result of that, his body developed these boils, and then the boils got bigger and bigger, and till the boils erupted all over the body, and then they broke out, and the kind of pus started to flow, and then he died from that illness. And then according to the Buddha, the Buddha looked into his destination and said that he was reborn in a bad destination. Okay, then another case, you can see here, somebody asked a question like, earlier, Like, how do you have respect for the Sangha when nowadays you look around and you see monks behaving badly? But even in the Buddha's time, you had cases like this where the Buddha had to bring up these warnings to the whole community. And then here we have another example, a monk who is a maker of arguments, quarrels, disputes, contentious talks, and brings up sort of disciplinary issues in the Sangha. This is sort of using different actions as a pretense for bringing up a kind of legal cases in the Sangha. So the 5 dangers: he doesn't achieve any higher attainments, he'll fall away from whatever attainments he's reached, he gets a bad reputation, dies confused, and then takes rebirth in the bad destinations. And we have the virtuous behavior. Oh yeah, this is the general advice. This is not specific for monks, but here the Buddha is speaking, I think, in Patali Gama on his last journey before he reaches nirvana. So he gives a discourse, he speaks about 5 dangers or drawbacks for an immoral person who acts contrary to the basic criteria or standards of ethical behavior. So an immoral person, deficient in virtuous behavior, loses much wealth because of heedlessness. Nowadays, I don't know. Though I think of one very prominent person who is not exactly a model of virtuous behavior. This past week, didn't he incur a loss of something like $250 million of his businesses? Usually they refer to him as TFG, the former guy. Or at least the business operations in New York City or New York State are being closed down. So it does happen, though there are still a lot of people of very bad behavior who are extremely wealthy. Then you get a bad report because of immoral behavior. That is true. Whatever assembly an immoral person approaches or enters, he approaches it timid and disconcerted. Again, I don't really know. You know, I can think offhand of a lot of people who are of very heavy immoral behavior, who are very confident, even a bit brazen and inflated with confidence when they enter assemblies and give talks. So I have a little bit of question about points number 1 and number 3, but I think on trust we can take number 4, that they'll die confused and with the breakup of the body after death, that such a person will be reborn in a bad destination. And then we have 5 benefits for a virtuous person who is accomplished in ethical behavior. That they'll accumulate much wealth because of heedfulness. Again, a little bit of doubt here. I know quite a number of people of good ethical behavior who very honest, and so when you're very honest, sometimes under contemporary conditions, you don't always succeed in accumulating much wealth. But certainly, at least among those whose opinions count, they'll acquire a good reputation. A virtuous person, whatever assembly they approach, they'll approach it confidently and composed. Again, a little bit of doubt here, because I know of numbers of people of very good virtuous behavior who are very shy about speaking up in public. But I think we could say with confidence that when a virtuous person is on the verge of death, they'll die unconfused with a clear mind because they recollect their good behavior and then they can rejoice in their good behavior. And with the breakup of the body after death, certainly if we accept the working of the law of karma, they'll be reborn in a good destination, either back into the human realm or into the heavenly realm. Maybe some people can have some comments about these points on which I raised some doubts. Gita, did you want to say something?
Can you hear me, Bhante?
Very clearly, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Bhante, for all the teaching. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Bhante, I have a question. You said that when you entered the Aryan lineage of a Sotapanna, Sakradagami, in a lay life, if somebody is scolding such a person or, accusing them of things that are wrong, wouldn't the same rules that apply for the monastics apply for amongst lay people as well? Because people out of ignorance, just yell and scream. So I'm just wondering and curious to know if a lay person has entered the stream and someone else, whether it's monastic or lay, doesn't matter, is disparaging or blaming or accusing unlawfully and incorrectly. Wouldn't that, what you just read in the sutta, apply in the situation as well? Not necessarily a monastic, but in a lay life.
I would think so too.
Right?
Yeah.
That's what I would think.
The sutta doesn't lay down any limitation of that principle to monastics.
Right. So what would one do then if that's the case? What would one do? Not engage in a conversation because you don't want the other person to get any demerits. You don't want any harm to the other person because you want to protect them because of your compassion. How would you steer such a situation? It would be really hard, Bhante. Because you don't get mad and you don't get angry because, you're in control of your emotional, well-being, but you don't want any harm to the other person who is, throwing these accusations. How would you steer that kind of situation, Bhante, with wisdom? Just not say anything or back off, or what do you do?
You mean if you're a noble person?
Yes.
In a way, you try to avoid provoking the other person into insulting and abusing you if you're a noble person, but it's not possible to avoid it completely. Like even the Buddha himself, the fully enlightened one, got abused, insulted, not only abused and insulted, but some people tried to create a scandal around the Buddha. There's a famous case, infamous case of the Brahmin girl Chincha.
Yes, correct.
Sort of incited by her fellow co-religionists to, what is the word, create slander around the Buddha by pretending that the Buddha got her pregnant.
Yes, that's correct.
Those things happen, yeah.
Yeah, those things happen. There's nothing you can do, basically, right? You just have to, yeah. Thank you, Bhante. Thank you.
And then, of course, the case of David Datta. Okay, so any comments on any of these or questions? Oh, I see. Okay, so there's one, Jaden, Rowan. Okay, lower.
Thank you, Bhakti. This question isn't related to the sutta. Is that okay?
If it's related to the sutta, it's okay. Yeah.
No, it's not.
Oh, it's
is
not?
that okay?
Ask the question.
So, I heard that a master could create their own realms. Is that possible?
What?
A master can create their own realms for the disciples to follow and go to. Is that possible?
A master can create their own realms?
Yes, because I heard that like a teacher if their disciples eat vegan and meditate 2 hours a day, they could bring them to their own realm.
This I don't know anything about.
Okay. Thank you, Bhante.
Okay, maybe we just slip in one last sutta. Actually, this is pretty much sort of standard. We've already come across these principles. But it's 5 dangers in speaking much. Actually, there's no harm in speaking much if you're going to speak wisely with consideration. But this is probably just a person who speaks a lot at random. If they get a telephone call from them, they'll speak for 2 or 3 hours. So, or you meet them in the Starbucks for coffee and they just go on talking and talking. They'll speak falsely, speak divisively, that is, in ways that create division, speak harshly, and speak idle chatter. And then with the breakup of the body after death, they'll be reborn in a bad destination. Maybe not necessarily by speaking a lot, but if they speak falsely, divisively, and harshly, especially in ways that are very serious, that could create the unwholesome karma leading to a bad rebirth. Whereas you speak judiciously with thought and consideration, then you don't speak falsely, divisively, harshly, with idle chatter. And then, especially if you're using wisdom and speaking, then with the breakup of the body after death, one is reborn in a good destination.
Venerable Dhammika Mahathera's most recent publication, titled Footprints in the Dust, hold great appeal for historians and researchers in the field of Buddhism. Discourse that delves into profound insights. Herein lies the wisdom and expertise of Venerable Dhammika Mahathera.
Yes, thank you. Yes, my new book just came out a few months ago. This is it here. Footprints in the Dust, the life of the Buddha from the most ancient sources. And friends, when I told friends that I was writing a biography of the Buddha, they said, oh, well, there are already hundreds of them. Do we really need another one? And my answer is, we could do with another one, because I've read hundreds of lives of the Buddha, and they're all pretty much the same. A small amount will be about the Buddha's life, and 50%, 60% will be about his teachings. There's nothing wrong with that, but if it's the life of the Buddha, it should be about his life for the most part. And if you read almost all, and certainly all the biographies of the Buddha I've ever read, they contain a few bits of information from the Pali Suttas, from the 4 Nikayas, and the rest is stories and legends that developed sometimes centuries after the Buddha. So what I've done here is I've restricted myself to just looking at the information in the 4 Nikayas and the Vinaya. And what emerges if you just use that material is quite a different story of the Buddha, quite a different biography, quite a different person emerges. I'll give you just one example of what I mean. So one of the iconic stories in the Buddha's biography is the 4 sights, the Chatu Nimitta. So supposedly King Suddhodana restricted Prince Siddhartha's life to a beautiful palace, but one day he managed to get out of the palace, and with his charioteer he went through the streets of Kapilavastu, and he saw an old man, a sick man, a corpse being taken for cremation, and a wandering ascetic, and he'd never seen these things before. And when he asked what they were and what they meant, the charioteer said to him, well, those things happen to everybody. And he was profoundly shocked. And it was this was the trigger that made him decide to renounce his family and search for the truth. And it's a great story, but it isn't in the Tipitaka. And I've mentioned this to people and they're really quite shocked because this is a pretty iconic story. And it's profoundly meaningful too, but it isn't in the Tipitaka. What is in the Tipitaka is a place where the Buddha says, I came to know of old age, sickness and death, etc., etc. So he talks about it as something that he'd heard about or experienced. Later storytellers have turned old age into an old man, sickness into a sick person, death into a corpse being taken for cremation. So I'm just restricting myself to what's in the Tipitaka. And what you find is a very interesting character. The second thing is it's simply not possible to write a from birth to death narrative of the Buddha by using the information in the Pali Tipitaka. Because although we know a lot about what the Buddha said, we know quite a lot about where he said it. And we know the incidents or the events that prompted him to say it. But for the most part, we have no idea when he said it. Okay, so we have a very little bit of information about the Buddha's childhood, youth, and early adulthood, but virtually nothing. Those who compiled the Tipitaka simply weren't interested in the Buddha's life before he became a wandering ascetic. It's only after that point that the Buddha tells us about how he went to two teachers, why he left his home, the two teachers he studied with, his period of experimentation and his enlightenment. So we have a sequence of events there. And then in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta we have an account roughly of the Buddha's, the last 12 months of the Buddha's life. But all the rest, the other 44 years, we know of things that happened, but we have no idea when they happened. And so we can't really write a biography in the sense of his ancestry, when he was born, his youth, his teenage years, his early adulthood, his marriage, etc. And then he met Devadatta and he did this and he did that. Now, we simply don't know when those things happened. So I haven't written an account, a narrative account of the Buddha's life. From the Tipitaka, you simply can't do that. So what I've done is I've gone through all of the suttas and picked out every piece of information that gives an idea of what the Buddha was like as a person, his habits, the way he spoke, how he conducted himself in public debates, how he collected his food, the clothing he wore, and why he wore that particular type of clothing, the similes he used, and so on. And all that information is usually in very small sound bites, if you like. And so each of them is really very, very small. But if you put them all together, it gives you quite a full and interesting and detailed account of what the Buddha was like as a person. And that's what the book is about.
A series of talks on this subject by the highly respected expert Venerable Ajahn Punadamo Mahathero. Today, we are honored to have Venerable Ajahn Punadamo here to present part 6 of his talk entitled Early Buddhist History and Theravada Buddhism in Sri Lanka.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. In the last couple of installments of this series on early Buddhist history, I took the story up to the reign of King Asoka and the Third Council. And one of the important initiatives of King Asoka was the sending of missionaries from India to neighboring countries in all directions, including the Greek world and Bactria and South India and Sawanabhumi, which is the Golden Land, which is what they're named for Southeast Asia, Burma in particular. And most importantly, for our purposes, to Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is, of course, an island, but it's actually a very short and easy sea passage from India. So at no time in Sri Lankan history has it been isolated. It's always been in contact, sometimes unpleasant contact in terms of invasions with the Indian subcontinent. So it was already, one could say, within the Indian cultural sphere before the coming of Buddhism. The Sinhala people themselves, who are the dominant ethnic group in Sri Lanka, originated in India, probably in the Bengal region, and they recount in their own chronicles that the first Sinhalese landed on the island on the very day of the Buddha's parinibbana. And the Buddha is said to have made, in the Sri Lankan story, the Buddha on his deathbed was said to have made a prediction that the island of Lanka would become a stronghold of Buddhism, and he entrusted the care of protection of the island to Sakka, king of the gods of Tawatingsa. And Sakka delegated it to Vishnu, which is a curious detail because Vishnu is not one of the deities that occurs in the older Pali sources. It became important in later Hindu belief. In any case, the Sinhalas were established in the island by the time of King Asoka and the missionaries. And the mission sent by King Asoka was headed by his own son, Mahinda, who had taken ordination and was a bhikkhu. And they converted the king of Sri Lanka at the time, Dewanampiya Tissa, who was already in friendly relations with King Asoka. And as we could expect from the chronicles of the time, the whole episode is full of miraculous events, including Sakka sending to Sri Lanka the collarbone of the Lord Buddha that had been kept in a stupa in Tawatingsa heaven up to that date. This occurred in 247 BC by the best reckoning. And the next year, 246 BC, the daughter of King Asoka, Sangamita, who was a bhikkhuni, arrived with a delegation of bhikkhunis to establish the bhikkhuni order on the island. And she took with her a cutting from the Bodhi tree. And this also is associated with miraculous events. When King Asoka wanted to send the cutting from the Bodhi tree, he thought it would be sacrilegious to take a knife or a saw to the tree. And his advisor, Moggallaputta, told him, just put your hand on the branch you want to cut, and the tree will sever itself. And the tree severed itself, and the branch floated through the air and seeded itself into a pot that was waiting ready. Sangamita took this cutting to the island, and it's said that on the voyage to Sri Lanka, the ship was attacked by Nagas who wanted to seize the Bodhi tree. So Sangamita used her supernormal power and turned herself into a supana, the giant birds, also called Garudas, that prey on Nagas. And she terrified the Nagas. But then they begged her for a chance to worship the Bodhi tree, and she relented out of compassion and delayed the voyage and let the Nagas take the tree to their kingdom for 1 week. So this episode of the coming of Buddhism to Sri Lanka was wrapped in these mythical episodes. It's part of the national heritage and part of the Buddhist heritage in Sri Lanka. And during the reign of this first Buddhist king, Devanampiya Tissa, the Mahavihara was established. And this is a very important institution in Buddhist history, in Theravadan history in particular. Every Theravadan bhikkhu alive today can trace his ordination lineage back to the Mahavihara, to this one monastery. This was the seat of Theravada. And as we recall from the episodes of the Third Council, at this time it was more properly called Vibhajyavada. It was the group that was deemed orthodox by Asoka and the Third Council. And these were the ones who established the Mahavihara, which became the central monastery of Sri Lanka. And over the years, other monasteries were established as branches of Mahavihara. So for some time, Buddhism flourished in the island, but the island of Sri Lanka had, in those centuries, had a troubled history with repeated episodes of invasions from South India and internal rebellions and disputed successions to the kingship. From 205 to 161 BC, there was a period when the island was under foreign rule, when the Tamils from South India occupied the capital of Anuruddhapura and forced the king into exile in the south of the island, which was always culturally a bit separate from the north. The king at the time was Duttagamani, and he is remembered in Sri Lankan history as a great folk hero because he liberated the island from the South Indian rule. And it's said that he defeated the Tamil king in single combat. In the Mahavamsa, there's one episode recorded about Duttagamani that's kind of troubling. It's said that when Duttagamani was nearing the end of his life, he asked one of his bhikkhu advisors, "Do you think I've made terrible karma in my life with all the people I've killed in the wars against the Tamils?" And this bhikkhu told him, "No, sire, you've made very little bad karma. You may have killed thousands and thousands of people, but only one of them had taken the refuges and precepts, and one more had taken the refuges without the precepts. So actually, you've only killed 1.5 people." This is a troubling a kind of a view to establish. It's basically saying that it's okay to kill non-Buddhists, which of course is completely not in accord, completely at odds with the Buddhist teaching. In any case, Duttagamani did reestablish a united rule under the Buddhist Sinhala nation in Sri Lanka. The next important episode for Buddhist history occurred in the reign of the king Watagamani, who reigned from 89 to 77 BC. And at that time, Watagamani founded the monastery of Abhayagiri that would later become very important. The story is that there was yet another invasion from South India, and although the king was victorious in the end, he was defeated in one battle. And as his troops were fleeing from this site, there was a Jain monastery at the site, and one of the Jain monks mocked him as they were retreating and said, "There goes the great lion of Lanka running like a coward." And Watagamani said, if I'm victorious in this war, I'll have that monastery leveled and build a Buddhist monastery there. And that's what he did, and built a Bayagiri on that site. Immediately with the founding of Bayagiri, there was trouble. There was a split or a schism with the Mahavihara monks, and this is put to a bhikkhu called Mahatissa, who was a favorite of the king. And when the king established a Bayagiri monastery, he gave it personally to Mahatissa, which is contrary to the Vinaya. A monastic property should belong to the Sangha collectively, not to an individual monk. So the Mahavihara monks expelled Mahatissa, which in the Sangha regulations means he was no longer welcome to sit in ceremonies with them. And this is an official or a ritual schism. So there was a separation already. And at this time, some of the Mahavihara monks decided that conditions were so uncertain at that time with the various wars and rebellions that were going on. It was a very troubled reign. And with the schism with the Bayagiri monks, they felt that there was a danger of the teachings being lost. So they held a council in the south of Sri Lanka, away from the capital, and rehearsed the whole Tipitaka while scribes wrote them down on palm leaves. And this was the first putting down of the Pali Canon into writing. It occurred at this time, and the decision was made to do so because of the fear that they would be lost, that the state of affairs on the island, which was supposed to be the stronghold of the Theravada school, the conditions were so troubled that they were afraid that teachings would become lost. There wouldn't be enough monks that were educated, qualified to recite the Pitakas. This occurred about 89 BC, and it was the first writing down of the Tipitaka. By the 200s AD, the Abhayagiri monastery, which from the beginning was always open to more eclectic and heterodox ideas, began to import Mahayana. The Mahavihara maintained a reputation and a tradition of being very orthodox and conservative and holding to the old teachings, whereas the Abhayagiri, their rival, was much more open to foreign influence and new teachers and new ideas. And by this time, too, things were being written down, so there would be an easier transmission of heterodox ideas because they could be transmitted by writing. In particular, the Abhayagiri adopted doctrines from what's called the Vatulya school, which seems to have been an early version of Mahayana, and held a number of doctrines about the transcendental nature of the Buddha that we discussed earlier in the episode about the dissident schools. For example, that the Buddha never really existed in flesh and blood on earth, but remained into Sita heaven and just sent a nimitta, an illusion down to the earth to teach. So they were turning the Buddha into an eternal God rather than an enlightened human. They also had some doctrines that approach the tantric position, in particular the idea that sexual relations could be a part of a spiritual practice. So from this time on, the early 200s, the Abhayagiri was moving more and more away from the mainstream or the orthodox position of the Mahavihara. The separation became greater. By the end of the 3rd century AD, we have the reign of King Mahasena, and a number of important events occurred during his reign. Tooth relic was sent to Sri Lanka from India. The kingdom that held the tooth relic before was in disarray, and they wanted to safeguard the tooth relic, so they decided to send it to Sri Lanka. And that's, of course, become a very important national symbol. And the consecration of all the new kings always was done after that date in the presence of the tooth relic. And even to this day, when a new government is sworn in Sri Lanka, even though the kingship has long since expired, when a new government is installed, they always make a pilgrimage to the tooth relic. Also, we have the arrival of a monk from South India called Sanghamitta. As a similarity to the name of the founder of the Bhikkhuni order in Sri Lanka, Sanghamitta, but that's entirely coincidental. They're not to be confused. This is a man, and the spelling in the Pali has a short a at the end, indicating a masculine noun. Sanghamitta became a favorite of the king, Mahasena, and he was very definitely a Mahayana. And he convinced the king to suppress the Mahavihara. So for 9 years, the Mahavihara was shut down, and the monks were scattered and exiled, mostly to the south, which was always kind of, the south of Sri Lanka was always kind of a semi-autonomous region, not totally under the control of the central monarchy. So often dissidents would go and hide out in the south. So the Mahavihara was out of favor, and the buildings were torn down, and the precious objects and building materials were sent to Abhayagiri to adorn their facilities. So at this time, we can see that the Theravada lineage had come to a low ebb. It was out of favor, it had lost its seat, and the monks were scattered. But after 9 years, there was something of a rebellion by some of the nobles against the king's policies, and a large part of that was his religious policies. And the king relented and allowed the Mahavihara monks to return and rebuild the monastery. But in the meantime, during those 9 years, another monastery that was a branch of Abhayagiri called the Jatawana Monastery had been established on the site, and now those monks were moved off, and they established another monastery called Jatawana that became a third. They were schismatic against both the other schools. They established a third, smaller, less important, but a third tradition in Sri Lanka. So both of these monasteries, or monastic traditions, because most of them, or if not most, probably all of the monasteries in Sri Lanka were adherents of either Abhayagiri or Mahavihara. We had these three traditions in establishing Sri Lanka, rivals. Then the next important event in the Theravadan history is the arrival of Buddhaghosa in the early 400s. Buddhaghosa was a very important figure in Theravadan history. He was a great scholar from northern India, and it's said that he converted. He was a Vedic Brahmin and had a great knowledge of the Vedas. And then he converted to Buddhism, and he went searching for the commentaries. There was supposed to have been commentaries put down by the followers of the Buddha in the period after the Buddha's parinibbana that were now incomplete or lost. And he searched for a complete set of the commentaries. And finally, he was advised to try Sri Lanka, and he went to the Mahavihara in Sri Lanka. And they did not have the original Pali commentaries anymore, but they had Sinhalese translations. So he offered to undertake the project of translating the Sinhalese commentaries back into Pali. And the story is that as a test of his abilities and orthodoxy, the Mahavihara monks, the elders there, gave him a test. You write a summary of the Buddha's teaching and we'll examine it and see if you know what you're on about. And so he wrote the Visuddhimagga, which is a very important text in Theravada tradition. It's the summary in all Theravada countries. It's a very highly respected text. The English translation is The Path of Purification. And the story is that after he'd written this, and it's a very big book. It's like 800 pages or so in the English version. And after he'd written this massive tome, mischievous devas hid the manuscript. And so the day he was supposed to present it to the Council of Elders, he had nothing to present. So they told him to go back and do it again. And he rewrote the whole thing from scratch. And then the devas produced the original, and they compared them, and they agreed syllable for syllable. Or so the story goes. In any case, he passed the test. He was verified by the elders and translated the commentaries back into Pali. And these are the commentaries we have today, very important texts that, called Atthakatha. And there are some additional ones written by Dhammapala a little later, but the bulk of the commentaries were written by Buddhaghosa. And they are very important for establishing the orthodox position within Theravada, and very useful for translators, because often if there's obscure or cryptic passages in the suttas or the Vinaya, the commentary will elucidate them, clarify them. Now we'll jump forward several centuries to a few more important events. In the years 1164 to 65 AD, there was a king Parakamabbahu who reunited the Sangha under the Mahavihara. This was following another period of disunity and turmoil in the island, which actually had quite a troubled history in terms of internal rebellions and secessions and external invasions. Throughout this entire history, we see these sorts of things again and again. But King Parakamabbahu was one of these great monarchs who managed to reestablish order, and he felt that the part of the disunity in the island was having these dissident religious groups, and he favored the Orthodox Theravada line, and he had the all the monks all the other monks had to either agree to return to the status of a novice and start again in the Mahavihara tradition, or disrobe altogether. So he suppressed the Abhayagiri and Jatawana traditions, and from then on, all the Buddhist monasteries in Sri Lanka were under the aegis of the Mahavihara, or the Orthodox Theravada. Another important detail that occurred in relation to this council that Parakama Bahu held to purify the Sangha was that a Burmese monk who had come to, was learned in the scriptures and was invited to come and assist with the work of the council. When he returned back to Burma, he established a lineage of his own, which is called the Sinhalese tradition, so imported from Sri Lanka. And that became one of the ordination lineages, important ordination lineages in Burma, and was later exported to Thailand. It's around this time, too, that the Bhikkhuni order died out in Sri Lanka, either just before or during the reign of Parikama Bahu. The Bhikkhuni lineage had dwindled so far that they could no longer assemble enough Bhikkhunis to do further ordinations, and when the last few remnants of the Bhikkhuni order died out, then there were no more Bhikkhunis. Then going forward again in time, the Buddhist tradition in Sri Lanka reached another crisis point in the late 16th century, when there was a king that favored Shaivism, the worship of the Hindu god Shiva, and he actively persecuted the Buddhists and suppressed the Buddhist monasteries. And although his reign was brief and he didn't completely destroy Buddhism, that combined with the problems of the European colonial powers that were now becoming aggressive, particularly Portugal in this phase, the Buddhist Sangha reached another low point, and the Bhikkhu order within Sri Lanka actually died out. And we don't exactly know when the last bhikkhus were ordained in Sri Lanka, but by 1750, there were no proper bhikkhus in Sri Lanka. And part of the problem seems to have been some internal corruption of the Sangha becoming a bit too wealthy and holding land, becoming landholders and having tenant farmers. So the monastic properties were now administered by laymen who wore white robes and took 8 precepts, and they were called Gananansi, were the substitutes for the monks because they could not do any proper ordinations anymore. But then in 1753, the Bhikkhu order was re-established in Sri Lanka from Thailand, or Siam as it was called. And the monks who were sent to re-establish the tradition in Sri Lanka were monks of that Sinhalese lineage that dated back to the reign of King Barakama Bahu and that Burmese monk. So the circle was closed. So the lineage did not die out in the wider world, but it had died out in Sri Lanka temporarily and was re-established from Siam. And after that, of course, Sri Lanka, from that date on to the present, had become a bulwark and a great center of Theravada tradition. So what we can take from this history, which is fairly abbreviated, I think I've covered the major points related to the survival and propagation of the Theravada. But what we can take from this history is the precarious thread by which Theravada came down to us today. It only really survived by a very narrow margin in more than one instance. And when we take the broader history going back to the beginning of this series, what I've been really trying to establish is the actual historical provenance of the Theravada school. It's sometimes claimed by adherents of Theravada that our school is the original unblemished teaching of the Buddha. And this is in fact the position taken by the Mahavamsa, that it's a direct, unbroken continuation from the original teaching. And that's not entirely false, but it's a bit simplistic. It's a bit of a simplified view. What we see from the very beginning was that this particular branch, beginning with the Staviravada after the Second Council, this particular branch always held it as an important central idea or an ethic of their school to try and maintain the Buddha's teaching in its original form. So it's always been a very conservative school, not open to radical innovations in either doctrine or practice. And this continued with the Third Council and the split between the Sarvastivadins and the Vibhajavadins. And the Vibhajavadins were those who held to the idea that past, present, and future can be distinguished. The Sarvastivadins are not that radically different otherwise from the Theravada. And if they still survive today, they would probably be able to argue a claim to preserving the original teachings as well. But as it happened historically, the Vibhajavada became established in Sri Lanka, and in particularly in this Mahavihara monastery. And some of the historical writing refers to that school from this period on as not yet even using Theravada, but calling it the Mahaviharavadins. Because the Abhayagiri monks also originated from that same root, from the monks who landed with Mahinda, although they split off from it. The Mahavihara became the center of Theravada teaching and orthodoxy, and this is where Buddhaghosa worked, who played a very important role in establishing and clarifying, defining the position of Theravada, and that and his work is held in all Theravada countries in great esteem. But even so, the Bhikkhu lineage actually died out for a while in Sri Lanka, and there was a period of a century or more when there were no monks in Sri Lanka, and they were reintroduced from Siam from a lineage that originated with the Mahavihara. So the circle was closed and the lineage was unbroken. So this series as a whole, up to this point, the intention has been to clarify and put into historical context the Theravada tradition and how it came to be and how it came to be established. And if we have an opportunity to continue this series in the future, I'd like to take it on into the further spread of Theravada into Savannah Bhumi or Southeast Asia. So thank you all for listening, and that will conclude.
Well, that's all for today. If you have any concern or questions, please feel free to contact us at info@buddhadharmatv.com. Thank you for watching the program, and I'm confident that many will gain from the programs on Buddha Dharma TV. Good night. Namo Buddhaya.